At 70, most voices that once ruled a stage begin to soften into memory. But Jimmy Fortune still steps into the light with the same quiet posture, the same unhurried breath, and that familiar tenor that can make an entire room stop moving for a few seconds. As if people are listening not just for a melody, but for proof that certain kinds of grace can survive time. From the audience, the picture looks simple. A humble man shaped by faith, a country gospel singer whose smile never asks for attention. Yet behind that calm presence is a life that has repeatedly demanded a price. And the cruelest part is that the bill never arrived all at once. It arrived in waves, disguised as ordinary days, long drives, and nights when applause was loud enough to hide what he was carrying. The story begins with a contradiction that follows him everywhere. He was raised in a home where music felt like oxygen, but peace was never guaranteed. Born March 11, 1955, in Staunton, Virginia, the seventh of 9 children, he grew up in a working-class world where comfort was scarce, but hymns were plentiful and the sound of a guitar could turn a small room into something larger than its walls. His mother's voice moved slowly through evening air, steady enough to feel like protection, while his father's guitar offered stray chords on the porch, fragments that still taught a boy how feeling can live inside sound. But the same house also taught him silence, not the peaceful kind, the survival kind, because alcohol often arrived before words did, and a child learns quickly that one wrong moment can tip an entire night into chaos. Years later, he would speak about his father's alcoholism without dressing it up, the kind of honesty that does not seek pity, only truth, and that truth explains why music became more than interest. It became escape without running, refuge without leaving, a way to stay in the same room while saving his own mind. When he found a broken guitar thrown away with only 2 strings, he did not see trash, he saw an opening. He played what was left for years, not caring what the notes were called, only noticing that his chest felt lighter when sound existed. Then Christmas came with a real guitar, 6 strings in his hands, and the moment froze him because for the first time the dream had weight. He asked if it was real, as if disbelief itself might shatter it. And when he told his father he wanted to make a living with music, the reply was firm but not cruel, the kind of adult certainty that closes doors for children without meaning to. Yet that refusal did not shrink his desire, it clarified it. In church services, his voice stood out not because it was perfect, but because it sounded sincere, and sincerity is the rarest technique of all. Still, the road between a gifted church singer and a professional life is not a straight line, and he did not begin with a glamorous leap. He worked at a car dealership, lived inside predictable shifts, then carried his guitar at night into places where music was treated like background decoration, restaurants where plates clinked louder than applause, roadside motels, veteran halls, community picnics. Small corners under dim lights where he sang, while people talked over him. Those nights blur together in the way ordinary struggle always does. And if there was a question that followed him home, it was whether his voice meant anything beyond the moment it left his mouth. On lonely drives through Virginia wind, he held a private belief that if God gave him a voice, there had to be a reason, even if that reason was not visible yet. Then one winter evening in 1982, in a room where no one seemed to truly listen, a man listened differently. Lou DeWitt, the tenor voice of the Statler Brothers, sat still and watched breath control, watched how a note was held just a fraction longer, watched the discipline beneath the softness. Lou was battling severe Crohn's disease, and behind his attention lived an unspoken fear. A legendary harmony was becoming fragile. After the set, he walked over and said one sentence that changed everything, an invitation to audition that sounded simple but carried a hidden burden, because an audition for a legendary group is not just a chance. It is a test of whether you can step into someone else's shadow without disappearing. On January 28, 1982, Jimmy drove to Nashville without fanfare, stood before men who had been together for decades, and did the only thing he could do. He sang. The silence afterward was not politeness. It was assessment. the kind of quiet that decides your future without raising its voice. That same evening, he stepped on stage with the Statler Brothers in Savannah, Georgia, first as a fill-in, then as an official member by August 1982, and from the outside it looked like a rival. But from the inside, it was the beginning of a pressure most people never see. He was not allowed to be merely good. He had to be the right kind of good, close enough to honor what audiences loved, different enough to be real, and every night he lifted his voice, he was measured against a memory that could not be replaced. The cruelest irony is that he reached the dream of his life precisely when he had the least permission to be weak inside it, and even before later tragedies would come. That was already its own wound. At the moment Jimmy Fortune officially stepped into the Statler Brothers, his life did not expand the way people imagine success does. Instead, it narrowed, because from that night forward, every breath he took on stage would be compared to a voice that already lived inside the audience's memory. To replace a singer in a legendary group is not to inherit a role, it is to inherit an absence, and absences are far more demanding than opportunities. Lou DeWitt was not simply a former member. He was a sound that people associated with their own pasts, with car radios, family trips, and songs that had quietly threaded themselves into American life. Jimmy understood this immediately, even if no one said it out loud. Applause came, but it arrived carefully, measured, as if the crowd were testing the ground before trusting it. He was not greeted as the future of the band. He was treated as a question mark. Every night on stage became an examination that did not end when the lights went down. He could not sing too much like Lou, because then he would be accused of imitation, but he could not sound too different either, because then he would be blamed for breaking something sacred. This invisible boundary followed him everywhere, into dressing rooms, onto the tour bus at 3 a.m, into hotel rooms where exhaustion hummed louder than applause. What people rarely understand about that kind of pressure is that it does not scream. It whispers constantly, reminding you that one bad night can erase 100 good ones. Jimmy learned to live inside that whisper, to carry himself with restraint, to never assume safety. In newspaper articles, his name appeared quietly, sometimes barely mentioned at all, as if the band itself were the only character that mattered. That anonymity within success became its own weight, because he was no longer a struggling unknown, but neither was he fully embraced. He was something in between, and living in between is one of the loneliest positions a person can occupy. Yet Jimmy did not respond with bitterness or rebellion. Instead, he found the only place where he could speak without being compared: songwriting. Late at night, after the show energy faded and the bus settled into its mechanical rhythm, he would sit alone with his guitar and write, not with the ambition to dominate charts, but with the instinct to contribute something honest, something that belonged. The first song that truly marked this shift was Elizabeth. It did not arrive as a statement of power, but as a gesture of gratitude, almost like a letter written quietly to the people who had given him space to stand, and especially to Lou DeWitt himself, whom Jimmy never spoke of as the man he replaced, but as the man whose place he was trying to protect. When Elizabeth reached #1, it did not feel explosive. It moved slowly, held by radio stations and listeners who recognized sincerity when they heard it. That quiet success mattered more than noise ever could, because it told Jimmy that he could belong without pretending to be someone else. But belonging came with a cost. As the band returned to the top of the charts, the road demanded payment. Tours grew heavier, schedules tightened, cities blurred into one another. One night barely ended before the next began, and rest became something postponed indefinitely. To the outside world, the Statler Brothers looked revived, strong again, a familiar name that refused to fade. Inside, Jimmy was learning how endurance can hollow a person if it is never balanced by stillness. His songs began to reflect this internal tension. My Only Love carried a restrained melody that felt like someone trying to keep balance while the ground shifted beneath him, and Too Much on My Heart arrived not as confession, but as admission, a moment when he allowed himself to name the weight he had been carrying in silence. These songs did not change the direction of the band. but they anchored it, pulling it back to the road where the connection with audiences was not abstract but physical. Night after night, halls filled earlier, tickets sold out, and people stood singing harmonies they had memorized years before, as if afraid that if they did not hold the moment tightly enough, it might disappear again. In 1988, when More Than a Name on a Wall emerged, its impact moved beyond charts entirely. It became a song for memorials, for rooms where grief had no vocabulary, for moments when families needed music to bow its head instead of raising its voice. That kind of legacy does not announce itself, but it lasts, and Jimmy understood that he was now part of something that lived beyond him. Still, the paradox remained. The more successful the band became, the more Jimmy had to give up pieces of himself that would never appear on stage. He learned how to smile through exhaustion, how to finish a show and still feel empty, how to answer phone calls home without knowing how to explain the strange loneliness of standing inside applause. This was not failure, but it was not peace either. It was survival dressed as achievement. By the late 1990s, after more than 4 decades together, the Statler Brothers began to sense something few artists ever admit, that there is dignity in leaving before the stage forces you away. Their decision to end was not born from conflict or creative collapse, but from an understanding that there was nothing left to prove. They chose a farewell tour, a slow closing of a chapter rather than a sudden break. And on October 26, 2002, they stepped off the stage together for the last time. For the band, it was closure. For Jimmy, it was something far more unsettling. He had entered their world when it was already complete, spent 20 years holding it together, and now the structure that defined him was gone. When the lights went out that final night, the question he had never allowed himself to ask rose quietly to the surface. If he was no longer the tenor voice of the Statler Brothers, then who was he meant to be? When the final notes of the Statler Brothers' farewell faded and the lights went dark for the last time, Jimmy Fortune did not feel relief the way many long-working artists do. What settled over him instead was a quiet disorientation, the kind that comes when a man has spent decades answering to a shared name and suddenly has to stand alone without rehearsal. For 20 years, his identity had been inseparable from a harmony line, from microphones arranged in a straight row, from the collective breath of 4 voices moving as one. Now that structure was gone, and the silence that followed was not peaceful. It was exposing. Jimmy would later admit that this was the first time he had to face a question he had skillfully avoided for most of his adult life. If he was no longer defined by the role that had shaped him, what remained underneath? The answer did not arrive quickly, nor did it arrive with confidence. It came slowly, in hesitation, in uncertainty, and in a humility that felt far more dangerous than any packed arena ever had. His solo career did not begin with a grand declaration or a dramatic reinvention. There were no attempts to outrun the past or prove independence through volume. Instead, Jimmy stepped forward cautiously, like someone leaving a well-lit room and needing time for his eyes to adjust. When his first solo album appeared in 2003, it did not announce a break from his history. It accepted it. The songs carried familiar tones of country and gospel, but without the shelter of harmony, his voice stood exposed, every emotion easier to hear, every crack harder to hide. That vulnerability was not a strategy. It was simply the reality of a man who had spent years blending and was now learning how to exist as a single line. He sang about faith not as doctrine, but as habit, something practiced quietly when certainty is no longer available. He sang about love not as triumph, but as endurance, something held together through patience rather than passion. The audience that followed him into this chapter was smaller, but more attentive, and Jimmy discovered something he had never fully experienced before, being listened to without comparison. Yet even as he adjusted to this new musical rhythm, his personal life was carrying unfinished weight from much earlier chapters. Jimmy had married for the first time at 17, an age when responsibility arrives before understanding has had time to catch up. He became a husband and a father while still learning who he was himself, and the collision between youthful hope and adult obligation left scars that did not fade easily. Music at that stage of his life was not success or stability. It was late nights in small bars, long drives with no guarantees, and the constant pull between providing for a family and chasing a calling that refused to wait. That first marriage did not end because of cruelty or scandal, but because immaturity met pressure and neither knew how to bend. Jimmy carried the guilt of that ending quietly, alongside the helplessness of trying to be present for children while his own life remained unsettled. A second marriage followed as his career with the Statler Brothers began to rise, and for a while it seemed as if experience might finally align with opportunity. But the demands of touring grew heavier, absences became routine, and distance expanded without confrontation. There were no explosive arguments, no public betrayals, only two people gradually losing synchronization. When that marriage also ended, Jimmy was left with a truth that success had not spared him from failure. He was admired on stage and fractured at home, applauded by strangers while feeling increasingly unsure of his footing in private. These were not stories he turned into songs directly, but they shaped the way his music slowed, deepened, and began to carry a weight that listeners could feel even if they could not name it. By the time his life reached a quieter turning point in the late 1990s, Jimmy was exhausted in a way that applause could no longer touch. It was then that Nina entered his life, not through spectacle or coincidence, but through ordinary presence. She did not ask about tours or accolades. She asked whether he had eaten, whether he was resting, whether he planned to stay. That simplicity unsettled him because it confronted a pattern he had lived by for years: constant movement as a substitute for stability. When they married in October 1998, it was not a dramatic shift the public could easily see, but it marked a profound internal change. Jimmy began to choose more carefully, to pause before accepting dates, to protect small routines that had once seemed insignificant. For the first time, staying felt as intentional as leaving once had. His family life became complex rather than tidy, shaped by children from different chapters of his life. But he no longer treated that complexity as something to hide. It was simply the shape his journey had taken, and he learned to inhabit it without apology. Just as this balance began to settle, Jimmy's body delivered a message he could no longer ignore. Years on the road, irregular rest, and unacknowledged strain caught up with him quietly. Fatigue arrived first, then breathlessness, moments of weakness that refused to explain themselves away. When doctors finally spoke clearly, the reality was severe: multiple coronary arteries dangerously blocked, a heart that had been working too long without mercy. In February 2023, Jimmy underwent a quintuple bypass surgery, an event that stripped away any illusion of control he still carried. Lying still without music, without an audience, he faced a possibility that no amount of faith or discipline could negotiate with: that he might not return to the life he knew. Recovery forced him into stillness, canceled shows, and days measured not by progress, but by patience. Pain, fear, and uncertainty became his daily companions, and faith shifted from something shared publicly into something practiced privately, a quiet request for enough strength to remain present one day at a time. With Nina beside him, reorganizing life into manageable rhythms, Jimmy began to understand that survival itself could be a form of success. Just as his health stabilized and life seemed to regain its footing, a blow arrived that eclipsed everything that had come before. In October 2024, his son passed away suddenly at the age of 51. There was no preparation for that loss, no framework within music or faith that could soften it. The death of a child does not announce itself loudly. It enters quietly and stays. For Jimmy, the grief had nothing to do with public identity. It was the raw absence of someone he had held, guided, and loved through years when he himself had not always been present. He did not turn that pain into spectacle or explanation. Those close to him noticed only that his voice deepened, his tempos slowed, and silence began to appear where songs once filled every space. Faith no longer offered answers. It offered endurance. At 70, Jimmy Fortune does not stand on stage to reclaim relevance or rewrite history. He steps forward with a heart that has been cut open and stitched back together, carrying losses that cannot be resolved, only carried. His performances are fewer, chosen carefully, and shaped by a new understanding. Music does not erase pain, but can sit beside it without judgment. That is why his voice still quiets a room. It is not because it is flawless, but because it has been broken and kept going anyway. By the time Jimmy Fortune reached his 70s, the word survival no longer felt dramatic enough to describe what his life had become. Survival suggests an ending point, a moment when danger fades and normal life resumes. But for Jimmy, there was no clear line between before and after. There was only continuation. After the loss of his son and a long recovery from heart surgery, he did not return to the stage as a man reborn or renewed. He returned as someone altered, carrying an understanding that could not be undone. The applause still came, but it no longer landed in the same place inside him. What mattered now was not whether he could still sing, but whether singing still made sense. And that question reshaped everything. Jimmy began to choose his appearances carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect for the limits his body and heart now demanded. Each performance became a decision rather than an obligation, a conscious act rather than a reflex formed by decades on the road. In smaller venues and more intimate settings, his voice took on a different weight. It was not louder, not more forceful, but more deliberate, as if each note had been considered before being released. Audiences sensed this immediately. They were no longer watching a legend maintaining relevance, but a man sharing what remained honest within him. When Jimmy spoke between songs, he did not offer speeches or lessons. He spoke sparingly, sometimes not at all, allowing silence to carry meaning where words might fail. This restraint was new, but it felt earned. His partnership with Brothers of the Heart reflected this same shift. Standing beside other voices of his generation, there was no competition, no urgency to impress. These were men who had already proven what they could do and no longer needed to measure themselves against one another. The harmonies were calmer, settled, shaped by experience rather than ambition. Jimmy fit there not as someone reclaiming a role, but as someone returning to a familiar shape of sound without the pressure that once defined it. Offstage, his life moved at a slower, more intentional pace. Health became a daily consideration, not a background concern easily ignored. Simple routines, meals, rest, and quiet time were no longer luxuries postponed until after a tour ended. They were the structure holding his days together. Nina remained a steady presence, not directing his life, but anchoring it, helping him maintain rhythms that once seemed impossible during years of constant movement. Family gatherings became more important than schedules, and when he spoke of his children, there was no attempt to frame the past neatly. He did not rewrite earlier failures into victories. He acknowledged them as part of a life lived imperfectly, a life shaped by choices made before understanding fully caught up. That honesty extended to how he viewed success. Jimmy never spoke about wealth or status with pride, and while estimates of his financial standing circulated online, he treated money not as proof of achievement, but as a form of freedom. Freedom to decline invitations, freedom to rest, freedom to remain silent when silence felt more truthful than song. He did not seek to place himself at the center of causes or campaigns, nor did he build a public image around philanthropy. Instead, he allowed his music to stand quietly beside people in pain, trusting that presence mattered more than performance. When a bronze statue of him was erected in his hometown, Jimmy did not receive it as a crowning moment. He saw it as a marker of distance traveled rather than a celebration of arrival. From a boy playing a broken guitar with two strings to a man stepping into the shadow of a legendary voice, to someone who endured losses no stage could absorb, the statue represented time more than triumph. It captured endurance rather than victory. Today, Jimmy Fortune does not attempt to stand out. He stands where he is, with a voice shaped by years of blending, breaking, healing, and continuing. When he sings now, it is not to promise hope or offer solutions. It is to acknowledge that pain exists and that it does not have to be carried alone. His story no longer asks audiences to admire success. It asks them to recognize persistence, the quiet kind that does not announce itself but remains. And as long as Jimmy continues to step onto the stage, even sparingly, even gently, his presence speaks to something deeper than music itself. It speaks to the simple truth that a life can be scarred, slowed, and softened, and still have something worth offering. What gradually became clear in this later chapter of Jimmy Fortune's life was that the most difficult work was no longer happening on stage, but in the quiet spaces between appearances. After decades of defining himself through schedules, harmonies, and obligations, he was learning something far more uncomfortable: how to live without constantly moving forward. For a man whose life had been measured by miles traveled and shows completed, stillness felt unnatural, even threatening. Yet it was in that stillness that the deeper reckoning took place. Jimmy began to understand that grief does not announce itself with drama. It settles in slowly, reshaping ordinary moments. Mornings carried a different weight. Silence lingered longer than before. Songs that once flowed easily now required pauses, not because the voice was gone, but because the heart needed time to follow. The loss of his son had not diminished his faith, but it had stripped it of simplicity. Faith no longer answered questions. It merely provided a place to stand when answers refused to come. Jimmy spoke less publicly during this period, not out of withdrawal, but out of a new respect for what could not be explained. He learned that some pain becomes smaller only when it is allowed to exist without commentary. Music, which had once been his refuge from chaos, now became something different, a companion rather than an escape. He did not sing to outrun grief. He sang to sit with it. This shift was audible to those who listened closely. His tempo slowed. His phrasing deepened. There were moments when he allowed a note to fade naturally instead of holding it for effect, as if acknowledging that not every space needs to be filled. Audiences noticed this change, even if they could not articulate it. They leaned in, not because the performance demanded attention, but because it invited presence. These were no longer concerts meant to impress. They were gatherings shaped by shared quiet, by recognition rather than excitement. Jimmy did not introduce songs with long explanations. He trusted that listeners would bring their own stories into the room, just as he brought his. Away from the stage, his days became more intentional. Health was no longer something monitored occasionally, but something considered daily. Each decision carried a new question. Does this sustain or does it drain? That question guided everything from travel to rest, from commitments to conversations. He no longer felt the need to say yes simply because an opportunity appeared. Saying no became an act of preservation rather than refusal. This was not an easy adjustment. There were moments when he wrestled with guilt, with the old instinct that productivity equals worth. But over time, he learned that survival itself had already earned him permission to choose differently. His relationship with his family also settled into a quieter honesty. There was no attempt to reconstruct the past or resolve every regret. Instead, there was presence. Phone calls that were not rushed. Visits that were not shortened by schedules. Conversations that allowed for silence without discomfort. Jimmy did not present himself as a man who had figured life out. He presented himself as someone still learning how to stay. This humility became one of the defining features of his later years. He no longer measured success by numbers or visibility. He measured it by whether he could wake up, breathe deeply, and remain open to the day ahead. When he returned to the stage after his surgery and loss, there was no announcement of triumph. There was no narrative of comeback. He did not frame his presence as a victory over illness or grief. He framed it simply as continuation. He stood there because he could, because his voice was still willing, because music still felt honest. In doing so, he resisted a culture that demands transformation stories with clear conclusions. Jimmy's story did not resolve. It unfolded. His performances during this time carried a different kind of authority, one that comes not from perfection, but from endurance. He did not sing above his experiences. He sang through them. Listeners who came seeking nostalgia often left with something quieter and heavier than expected. They did not leave entertained in the traditional sense. They left accompanied. That perhaps was the greatest shift of all. Jimmy Fortune had spent much of his life supporting harmonies, filling spaces, holding structures together. In this phase, he allowed himself to simply be present, to offer his voice as it was, without apology or explanation. The absence of his son remained, not as a wound to be healed, but as a reality to be carried. And in carrying it openly, without spectacle, Jimmy showed something rare. That dignity does not require closure. It requires honesty. His life, once defined by constant motion, had slowed into something more deliberate. The road was no longer endless. The stage was no longer obligatory. Music was no longer a shield. It was a language he used carefully, respectfully, and only when it felt true. In this way, Jimmy Fortune did not retreat from the world. He re-entered it on his own terms, carrying less urgency but more depth. And for those who listened, that depth resonated more powerfully than any high note ever could. In the later stretch of Jimmy Fortune's journey, something subtle but profound began to take shape, a shift not marked by headlines or milestones, but by restraint. After years of learning how to survive loss and illness, he reached a stage where the question was no longer how much he could endure, but how gently he could live with what remained. This was not resignation. It was discernment. Jimmy had spent a lifetime responding to demands, audiences, schedules, expectations that arrived, whether he was ready or not. Now, for the first time, he allowed himself to ask a quieter question before each step forward. Does this align with the life I can still carry? That question did not always produce easy answers, but it created space, and space was something he had rarely known. He began to notice how his body spoke before pain arrived, how fatigue whispered long before it shouted. The discipline he once applied to music shifted inward, toward listening rather than projecting. There were days when he chose not to sing, not because he could not, but because silence felt more truthful. That choice, once unimaginable, became an act of respect for himself, and for the music he refused to cheapen by forcing it. When he did step on stage, the atmosphere changed almost immediately. There was less spectacle and more attention, less anticipation and more presence. People did not come to witness a comeback. They came to sit with something familiar that had aged honestly. Jimmy no longer tried to lift a room with energy. He grounded it. His voice, shaped by years of blending and breaking, carried a depth that could not be manufactured. Each phrase felt considered, not for effect, but for meaning. The pauses between lines became as important as the notes themselves, allowing listeners to breathe, to remember, to feel without being guided. In those moments, Jimmy was no longer performing endurance. He was modeling acceptance. Acceptance did not mean approval of loss or pain. It meant acknowledging that life had taken what it would, and that resisting this truth only added another layer of suffering. This understanding filtered into how he spoke, how he moved, how he interacted with people who approached him after shows. He listened more than he talked. He did not rush conversations toward comfort or optimism. He allowed stories to end where they naturally did, even when they ended in uncertainty. People often left those encounters surprised by how seen they felt, not because Jimmy offered solutions, but because he did not interrupt their grief with reassurance. He knew too well that reassurance often serves the speaker more than the listener. At home, his days were shaped by small rituals rather than goals. Morning routines, shared meals, quiet walks, moments of reading or prayer that asked for nothing dramatic. He learned to appreciate days without events, days that did not need to be remembered to be meaningful. This recalibration did not erase sadness, especially the absence of his son, which remained present in unexpected ways. A song lyric would surface and catch him off guard. A memory would arrive without warning. Instead of pushing these moments aside, Jimmy allowed them to pass through him. He learned that grief does not demand constant attention, but it does require permission. The more he allowed it to exist, the less it controlled him. This balance extended to his faith as well. Faith was no longer a structure that explained the world. It became a practice of humility, an acknowledgement that some questions remain unanswered and that living well does not require solving them. He stopped asking why certain things happened and began asking how he could remain open despite them. That openness did not make him fragile. It made him steady. In a culture that celebrates resilience only when it looks victorious, Jimmy's quiet steadiness stood out. He did not frame his life as an inspirational arc. He did not turn suffering into a lesson for others. He simply continued, one measured step at a time, allowing music to remain part of his life without demanding that it define him entirely. The absence of urgency became his greatest strength. There was no longer a need to prove relevance or justify presence. He sang because singing still felt like truth, and he rested when it did not. This clarity filtered into everything he touched. Collaborations were chosen carefully. Commitments were weighed honestly. Time was treated as something finite and valuable rather than endlessly renewable. Through this lens, Jimmy Fortune's later years revealed something rare. A man who had learned to carry loss without letting it harden him, to honor limitation without resenting it, and to remain present without needing to be central. His life no longer moved toward a climax or resolution. It moved toward coherence. Each part, painful or peaceful, found its place without demanding explanation. And in that coherence, his voice found a new kind of strength, not louder or brighter, but deeper, capable of holding silence without fear. As Jimmy Fortune's journey moves into its final chapter, there is no sense of arrival, no moment that feels like a closing statement. What defines this stage of his life is not resolution, but continuity. At 70, he no longer measures his days by what has been achieved or lost, but by what can still be held with care. The voice that once carried the weight of expectation now carries something quieter and more honest: permission. Permission to feel, to pause, to remain unfinished. When he steps onto a stage today, it is not as a man defending a legacy or revisiting former glory. It is as someone who understands that simply showing up truthfully is enough. His presence does not demand admiration. It invites recognition. Recognition of shared fragility, of time passing, of the fact that endurance often looks nothing like triumph. Jimmy's life has been shaped by moments that could have ended everything. Poverty that narrowed possibility, anonymity that tested faith, pressure that hollowed success, illness that threatened his body, and grief that altered the meaning of love itself. Yet the most striking thing about his story is not that he survived these moments, but that he refused to let them turn him into something hardened or distant. He did not retreat into bitterness or armor himself with detachment. Instead, he softened. And in a world that often rewards hardness, that choice required a different kind of strength. His music now reflects this softness. It no longer seeks to lift people above their pain. It stands beside them within it. When he sings, there is space in the room, space for memories to surface, space for tears that do not need explanation, space for silence that feels shared rather than empty. Audiences respond not with excitement, but with stillness. They listen not because they expect something extraordinary, but because they sense something genuine. Jimmy understands this exchange deeply. He knows that at this point in life, authenticity matters more than perfection, and connection matters more than performance. Offstage, his life remains deliberately modest. He does not surround himself with reminders of what once was, nor does he chase symbols of what could still be. His sense of sufficiency comes not from accumulation, but from freedom. Freedom to say no without apology. Freedom to rest without guilt. Freedom to sing only when it feels true. Financial security, earned through decades of steady work, has become a support rather than a destination, allowing him to live lightly, without urgency. He has never sought to position himself as a symbol or spokesperson, and even when recognition arrives, it does not seem to change how he sees himself. When a statue was erected in his hometown, he did not interpret it as a celebration of victory. He saw it as a reminder of time, of distance traveled, of a road that demanded patience more than brilliance. That perspective defines everything about how he moves through the world now. Jimmy Fortune does not try to stand out. He stands present. He listens carefully. He speaks sparingly. He carries his losses without spectacle. The death of his son remains a constant, not as a wound seeking closure, but as a presence that reshaped his understanding of love. He does not claim to have found meaning in that loss, nor does he offer it as a lesson. He simply acknowledges that some grief becomes part of who we are, and that living well does not require understanding everything. Faith, in this final chapter, is not certainty. It is humility. It is the willingness to keep going without answers, to trust that remaining open is better than becoming closed. This humility extends to how he views his own story. He does not frame his life as inspirational or instructive. He does not summarize it neatly. He allows it to remain complex, unfinished, and human. And perhaps that is why his story resonates so deeply. It does not promise that pain will disappear or that effort will always be rewarded. It suggests something quieter and more realistic, that life continues even after it breaks us, and that there is dignity in choosing to participate in it anyway. As long as Jimmy Fortune continues to lift his voice, whether in song or in silence, his journey remains unfinished. Not because something is missing, but because life itself does not conclude cleanly. It unfolds slowly, imperfectly, and often without explanation. And in that unfolding, Jimmy has found a way to remain gentle, to remain honest, and to remain present. That is what endures. Not the titles, not the numbers, not the applause, but the sense that a man can be wounded, slowed, and changed and still have something real to offer the world.